When was the last war between Britain and France, do you think? And how did it start? Well, that's what this video, which has been sponsored very kindly by ExpressVPN, but more of that later, is all about. Now, if you are a frequent viewer of this channel, then you probably know your history, and particularly your military history, and so you're thinking, oh, well, I must know this one. Actually, it's harder than you might think, isn't it? Now, if you know anything about military history, you'll know about Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars. Right, okay, so that was definitely a war between Britain and France. So presumably there's been another one since then. Yes, there has. So what would it be? There are so many dominions all around the world, French Guyana and Madagascar and Morocco and all sorts of islands dotted about here. Yeah, it's probably some little dispute on a little island somewhere. Well, no, actually it's more significant than that. Okay. But I think, is it Vietnam? Because it was French Indochina, wasn't it? No, wait, the British stayed out of that one. Yeah, and you can think it's actually more complicated than you might think. And yes, there are lots of potential ones for this, but I have one in mind and I will make my way there via a number of the preceding events which turned out to be causes of it. So we won't be wasting our time. Now, you've probably heard of the Crimean War, 1853. Well, the French and British were both involved in that, but actually the French were allied with the British. It didn't particularly help that Raglan, who'd lost an arm at Waterloo and was commanding the British, kept using the word French, he couldn't say his R's properly, to mean enemy. Yeah, so we're going to advance on the French up there. What? Yes, you can see them there, they're wearing grey. Yes, the Russians. Well, I know I said French. All right, not the French, the Russians. Which didn't always go down well brilliantly with the French. And there was this attitude that the French had that if anything went horribly wrong with the British, this would be put down to the great failings of how rubbish the British army were. So Charge of the Light Brigade, which the Victorian British were just in ecstasy over because it was just such a tragedy, but such a romantic tragedy. A lot of the French just thought, stupid roast beefs, that's what they called us. People tend to call other people after what they eat. So the British call the Germans krauts after sauerkraut, and the Americans call the British limeys because of our extremely sensible habit of the time of taking lime juice in ships, so that our navy uniquely didn't get scurvy. So joke's on you, Yanks. Not that you eat Yanks. Well, anyway, the British called it the French frogs because they eat frogs, which is disgusting, and the French called us roast beefs. Again, joke's on you, France, because roast beef is really nice. Anyway, so they would see a failing, and this would just stoke this idea amongst the French military that the British army was rubbish. And it is certainly true that the British army was always pretty small. Now, it was the British, if you remember, who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, or was it? It was actually a conglomerate army of loads of troops from all around Europe, many of which had been fighting on Napoleon's side until not that long before, and were considered very unreliable. Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, he had to place cavalry units behind them in order to stop them running away because he really didn't trust them. But even the chaps in the red cochineal jackets, the actually in the British army, British regiments, an awful lot of those weren't actually what you might think of as British. Loads of them were Irish, for instance, and there were others which were mercenaries hired in from Germany and the like. The British army, the number of people within, I'll use the word here, England, who actually were in the British army was quite small. England was a nation of shopkeepers. You see, we weren't in Europe. If you're in Central or Western Europe, you're very likely to share one border with France and maybe another one with Germany. And that is not a safe place to be. Whereas Britain, in this sceptred isle surrounded by nature's moat, didn't have to worry so much about that sort of thing and never saw it as very necessary to have a huge army. When the empire got very big, having a really good navy was extremely important. And even the French, albeit grudgingly, admitted that the British Navy, the Royal Navy, was yeah, that was pretty good. They're pretty good sailors, but their army was rubbish. This was just the mindset that they got into. Now, let's go forward now to 1870. So, the Franco-Prussian War. The Franco-Prussian War, the British didn't get involved, at least not officially. It was over pretty quickly, all within 1 year. The Prussians invaded, went the traditional route to Paris through Verdun, and besieged Paris, and pretty soon the French surrendered and it was all over. But oh, it really rankled. There were loads of people who wanted revenge for that. And one of those was Philippe Pétain, who would later rise to command the French army in the Second World War. Well, in the First, and then later the Second World War. And he was a devout Catholic, was Pétain, and he was, in fact, imagining that he was going to be a priest. But after the Franco-Prussian War, he felt differently. He thought, right, no, it's the army for me, and I will get my revenge. It's strange how revenge seems to be a motivator for so many of the characters in this story. It's a motivator that I myself don't particularly recognise. I don't ever feel very vengeful. And when I see a character in a film or something whose chief motivation is revenge, I think, do people really get motivated by revenge all that much? But history records that, yes, some of these characters, Pétain amongst them, did. Now, a lot of Pétain's contemporaries were going off around the world to see action in the various French possessions around the world, but he thought, no, I'm going to wait here to get that revenge. Eventually the big one is going to happen here. And he waited 36 years. But I'll get onto him in a moment. Let's not jump the gun. We've got to think now of 1879. Now, 1879, in France, there were the Bonapartists who, because people quite like royal dynasties or something, I don't know, they just wanted another Napoleon. They'd had Napoleon and Napoleon II and Napoleon III. They wanted Napoleon IV. And there was a Louis Napoleon, the Prince Imperial, as he was known. Imperial. I mean, it's so royal. It's so non-republican, isn't it? It's rather bizarre in the context of France. But there you go. People just love dynasties and royalty, it seems. Anyway, he had persuaded the British to let him go and fight with them against the Zulus in southern Africa. Unfortunately, he died. Now, the load of Zulus attacked the unit that the Prince Imperial was amongst, and that unit tried to get away, and most of the unit did get away, but Louis Napoleon didn't, and he died. Apparently, he died tremendously, gallantly. He was stabbed with an assegai, and he pulled it out and carried on fighting, but yeah, he died. And the Bonapartists were not happy about that, and they blamed the British. And they said that his escort ran away, abandoning him. Well, that's one way of looking at it. You could also say that there was a unit of troops, and he was in it, and each man was effectively the escort of all the others, and some people got away and others didn't. I don't believe that any of them was specifically abandoning him so that he would die, but that's the way it happened. Now, 1898, the Fashoda incident. This was a biggie. Now, Fashoda was a grotty, mud brick Arab slave trading town in what most of the books will tell you was Sudan. Although today, they're out of date books, you see, today it's South Sudan because the country has split. Anyway, 13 years earlier, a chap called Gordon, who became known as Gordon of Khartoum, had gone out there and was taken by the forces of the Mad Mahdi and beheaded. And he needed vengeance, and certainly there were lots of French people who thought, why did the British not avenge Gordon? And there were people within Britain saying Gordon must be avenged. I mean, he got to be played by Charlton Heston in the movie, so he's clearly a significant chap. But it was 13 years later that an expedition set off under the command of one Horatio Herbert Kitchener. You know, your country needs you. Of course, that poster came later, but yeah, that Kitchener. A strange detail about Kitchener, by the way, is that some people, he feared that people wouldn't take him seriously because he looked a bit strange sometimes. He would wear, as men did in those days when they were outdoors, a hat. And of course, if you're in a very sunny country, you have a broad-brimmed hat that shades your hair, and your hair's largely under your hat. But his blonde, magnificent, big blonde moustache would be bleached white by the sun. So when he took his hat off indoors, he looked very strange with blonde hair and a white moustache. Even though he wasn't particularly old at the time. Anyway, you didn't need to know that detail. I just threw that in there. he was making his way up the river and building a railway as he went. And so the stories used to go. He got to within sight of Fashoda, and Sanctions, spats and gaugers! There's a tricolour flying! Now, that is the way the story has been told many times, and still sometimes is told, as though he was genuinely surprised by this. I don't know if he knew that the French were specifically going to be in Fashoda. They'd been there for a while, actually, because we now know that after the Battle of Omdurman, in which he defeated the dervishes, he opened some secret orders from London that told him the real reason behind this expedition. It wasn't actually to avenge Gordon. If it were to do that, surely they would have done it more than 13 years later, quicker than 13 years later. No, it was actually to investigate and head off the French, because the French, it seems, were trying to deny territory that was British to the British, and they were also running guns to the opponents of the Italians in Abyssinia, which maybe wasn't such a bad thing for the British, but that's another thing that the French were up to. They were up to stuff in Africa. They were working against the interests of rival colonial powers, the Italians and the British in particular. And the British had an ambition. It's a really staggering ambition. They were going to build a railway and a telegraph line from Cairo in the north of Africa all the way down to the Cape, right at the bottom of Africa, and perhaps all on British territory. Wouldn't that be an amazing achievement? The French, however, had an incompatible ambition, which was to do pretty much the same thing, but going west to east. And it was from the west that Jean-Baptiste Marchand had led an expedition. It was an extraordinary expedition. Lots of Senegalese soldiers. Senegal, of course, was a French possession. A load of French officers, and an amazing amount of stuff that they were carrying. They were carrying, as well as 2,000 bottles of claret and a hurdy-gurdy that played the Marseillaise, they were carrying a disassembled steam launch, quite a large ship, and a number of smaller steel vessels, which I think were also disassembled. I mean, if you're going to be a porter and risk your life, they lost 30 people getting as far as Fashoda in various accidents. They'd been wading through marshes that sometimes came up to their necks. Wild animals had attacked, and all that sort of stuff. But if you're going to carry a heavy load, risking your life all the way across Africa, you're going to want to make sure that load is, important. Anyway, they got to Fashoda and they took it and held it, flew the tricolour above it, and then they got attacked by dervishes, and then they got attacked by dervishes again, and things were going really badly for them. They were very dangerously low on ammunition, and when they sighted a load of ships coming up the river, the Nile, towards them, their first thought was, oh no, it's more dervishes come to finish us off. Now, Horatio Herbert, he's often listed, by the way, as Herbert Kitchener, but his name was Horatio Herbert Kitchener. Possibly he went by his middle name more often. I don't know. He had actually taken part in the Franco-Prussian War. He was a volunteer ambulanceman on the French side, and he'd picked up quite a bit of French. And he was a bit of a Francophile by this stage. So when he turned up, he spoke passable French and was very diplomatic. Now, he had his orders, which was to essentially see these French off, but he saw no reason to actually go to war against them, and he had just saved them from the dervishes, having just fought the Battle of Omdurman. Then this enormously pressed, by the way, a young journalist. He was 25 years old, and his name was Winston Churchill, who was accompanying this expedition, and the following year he wrote a book about it called The River War, which you can still read today. And when he saw that the French tricolour was flying, he was very scathing about it. He thought that these French had just come to spitefully rob the victor of his spoils. Anyway, he took part, by the way, in the last great cavalry charge, and the famous quote there is nothing more exhilarating than to be shot at without result. So Kitchener was very diplomatic, and he went into the town, the French couldn't really keep him out, and allowed the tricolour to be flown alongside other flags. He was flying the Egyptian flag because he was the head of the Egyptian army. He was wearing Egyptian uniform. And yes, he was conquering this territory in order to free the Egyptians from the threat of the Mad Mahdi. Anyway, negotiations went on for quite some while, and the French were very reluctant to leave. And something that he could do was bring in, because he got a good logistics train behind him, which Gordon didn't have, he was able to bring in fairly recent newspapers and show the French, oh, have you heard about the latest in the Dreyfus affair? Now, the Dreyfus affair. The Dreyfus affair had actually started some years earlier. The Dreyfus affair started in 1894, and there was a French officer whose name was Alfred Dreyfus, and he was a very unusual thing for a French officer in the 1890s. He was Jewish, and he was very surprised that he was suddenly out of nowhere accused of selling secrets, French military secrets, to the Germans. The French, you see, had found out that someone was selling military secrets to the Germans, and this became apparent and public, and so something had to be done. So what did the French authorities do? They looked for a scapegoat, of course, and Dreyfus, yeah, he'd do. So they picked on him, gave him a ridiculous show trial, found him guilty on the most trumped up and flimsy of evidence, and sentenced him to life on Devil's Island. Now, Devil's Island is a small island that was off, still is I suppose, off French Guiana, where there was a notoriously nasty prison. The guards there were notorious for their brutality, and the death rate was horrendous. Something like 3/4 of the prisoners who went there never came back. And so he was sent off there, packing, job done, out of the way. So there we go, we found the culprit, we sent him away. The honour of the French army has been saved. Trouble was that it was so obviously trumped up that a lot of people said, hang on. And people, the other side of the English Channel as well, were starting to take notice. And people were publishing articles in British newspapers saying, there's something wrong here. And there are plenty of French people saying, there really is something wrong here. Now, it became apparent that the actual culprit was someone else entirely. A count and a major and a Christian. And his name was, I've got it written down on a piece of paper, here we go, Ferdinand Esterhazy. Ferdinand Esterhazy. Now, it turns out that he wasn't actually a count at all, but he'd been calling himself a count for so long that people had just generally assumed, well, he must be a count. I mean, you can't go around calling yourself a count your whole life without, if you're not actually a count. So, but he wasn't a count. And this guy with a tremendous military pedigree, his father was a general, oh yes, and he'd risen spectacularly fast to the rank of major. The trouble is that he was also an inveterate gambler and gambled away his fortune. So this grand aristocratic senior military guy actually needed the money and been selling secrets to the Germans. But they gave him a trial and he was acquitted. And a lot of people said, how was he acquitted? He had guilt written all over him. And Dreyfus, meanwhile, is still languishing on Devil's Island. This is such an injustice. The British newspapers got more and more interested. And of course, Dreyfus's family as well were very keen to exonerate their man. So British private investigators were employed to prove who the real culprit was. And they came up with such utterly damning evidence against Esterhazy that surely that would be the end of the matter. But it wasn't. You see, when presented with new information that makes it quite clear that you were wrong, what a lot of people do is rather than go, oh yeah, actually, yeah, looks like we were wrong. Okay, we better reverse that decision then. You double down. And the authorities double down. No, he's guilty, absolutely guilty. And the Catholic Church weighed in against Dreyfus. Possibly a bit of anti-Semitism there. He's not one of us, Jew, probably guilty. And even when it became absolutely apparent that the Catholic Church knew that he was innocent and had still said that he was guilty publicly, they still didn't back down. They said, oh, well, it was for the greater good being the reputation of the French army. He was brought back in 1899, emaciated and shivering with malarial fever. And would you believe it, he was given another trial and again found guilty. But Esterhazy himself, when it became clear that his position was just untenable, he fled to Britain, where he changed his name and later died. And one of the officers who had testified falsely in his defence at the trial killed himself. So more and more and more scandal. And this was all hitting those who loved the French army, hitting them here because this was, hitting them to the core. This was such a dishonour to the army. And it was news of this that Kitchener was, have you seen the latest about the Dreyfus affair? Dreyfus affair was huge on both sides of the Channel. Queen Victoria was going to visit France and she cancelled her visit because she felt so sorry for that poor Dreyfus man. He was, later the authorities pardoned him, which was another mistake. You don't pardon someone when they're obviously innocent, because pardoning someone suggests that, yes, you did the thing, you are guilty, but we forgive you out of our magnanimity. No, you're the ones in the wrong. I was flipping innocent, maintained Dreyfus the whole time. And before he'd been shipped out there, he'd been very publicly stripped of all his medals and had his sword broken in public in a ceremony to show what dishonour that had fallen upon him. And they then had to reverse that, and he was fully reinstated to the army, given a promotion and a big medal. There you go, Légion d'honneur, I think he was given. So there you go. Well done. Well done. On yes, you passed the test. Well done. But that was really far too late. The damage to the honour of the French army had been done, and it struck to the core those Frenchmen in Fashoda. What? But should they persist? Because if it actually came to a fight between the British and the French in Fashoda, the British would win. There were 10 times as many of them, and they were much better armed. So it was a foregone conclusion, really, if they were going to try to fight their way out, but they didn't want to leave. But eventually, orders from above came through that, they should leave, because this could have led to a war between Britain and France. There were some people even thinking that just the Dreyfus affair could have led to a war between Britain and France, but the Fashoda affair was a more obvious thing. This was two military forces, although actually, of course, the French force wasn't officially a military force. It was actually an exploratory expedition, but it was a military force coming to blows, and that could have led to war. And the French saw at this point that maybe the British were more useful as allies against the Germans. So eventually the French had to back down and leave. In disgust, one of the last Frenchmen to leave uprooted the flagpole and hurled it to the ground, the flagpole that had been flying the tricolour earlier. But the British were being as courteous as they could be, and the military band that was with Kitchener's force played the Marseillaise as they left, which was nice. But the damage to Anglo-French relations had been done. Now, fast forward next to the Boer War. Now, the Boer or Boer War, which is 1890-1992, did involve the French, and it wasn't just the occasional volunteer going along off his own bat to fight against the British. No, actual units, actual legions of French troops went to fight against the British in the Second Boer War. But it wasn't France declaring war on Britain. It wasn't actually a war between the two nations. So even though they were fighting against the British, and of course they lost, This didn't lead to any conflict between the British and the French. Some feared that it might do, but it just didn't. The French, when they were defeated and captured, fully expected to be shot. But the British actually treated them very nicely, and so there you go, no hard feelings, goodbye. And they were shipped home. So, no, that doesn't count either. It wasn't the Boer War, but again, it was another little blow that rankled the French. Now, then came along something that you may have heard of, the entente cordiale. Oh, the entente cordiale. Oh, the British and French getting on so well. Oh, yes. There was a very successful visit by King Edward VII to France, and he shook all the right hands and did all the right things and pleased everyone and smoothed everything over, and it was all great. And the following year, they were able to sign the entente cordiale, which was not an alliance, as many people mistook it, between Britain and France. It was just an agreement not to tread on each other's toes out there in the wider world. The Germans, however, they definitely saw it as an alliance between the British and French, and that made it slightly more dangerous than perhaps others realised it was. Now, what they agreed was borders. So, for instance, the watershed between the Nile and the Congo, that would be a watershed between also British and French interests in Africa, and the French could do whatever they liked in Guyana and Madagascar and pretty much anything they liked in Morocco, but no building a fort where it'll interfere with the safety of Gibraltar. You can't do that. But apart from that, yeah, do what you like in Morocco. That'll be your territory. We, the British, won't interfere. But on the other hand, you, the French, won't interfere with our various interests. That was the entente cordiale. So, yeah, that's not actually an alliance, but it's certainly not a war. It's definitely not a war. But World War I came, and the alliance between Britain and France was actually signed right at the start of the war itself. It wasn't until that moment the Germans have started a war. Okay, we're going to take part. We need an alliance, and then there was an alliance signed between Britain and France, not before. And let us fast forward now to Verdun. So it's 1916, and the Germans were taking their traditional route to Paris. And whereas the Battle of Verdun in 1870 had lasted just a few weeks, Verdun ended up being the longest battle in history. It lasted for 10 months, and it was utterly horrendous. In just 4 square miles of land, nearly 1 million men bought it. The French lost 120,000 dead, the Germans lost 100,000 dead, and nearly 750,000 were seriously wounded. The conditions for both sides were utterly horrendous. And put in charge of this was Pétain. Remember? Our man who'd been waiting for his revenge? And he almost was too old, because when the war started he was 58 years old, and it was mandatory to retire as a major at age 60. He could have had quite a cushy time. It would have been a nice pension for a French major at that time. But no, the war started just in time for him to get his chance for revenge against the Germans. And he was put in command of Verdun, and he proved quite resilient. He was actually quite a caring commander by many accounts. He really cared for the safety of his men under him. But he was also quite an unaggressive one, because in that sort of warfare, if you want to gain ground, if you want to attack the enemy, you have to get out of your defences and then make it across no man's land, which is really dangerous. And it was so much easier for the defender to inflict casualties than the offender. So if you just stayed where you were a lot safer, and you would lose far fewer men. But High Command wasn't too impressed by that. No, the object of this isn't to see how long you can last in your trench. The object is to defeat the enemy. You have to get out there and be a bit more aggressive. Now, Pétain was only actually in command at Verdun for 2 months. But during that time, the British press had really, to use the vernacular of the young folk these days, bigged him up. And they said, he is the hero of Verdun. And they were saying so many great things. They ended up being given the Grand Order of St. Michael and St. George. Oh yeah, that's a big gong. So what the French did is they kicked him upstairs. They gave him a promotion to make him a bit more senior, but actually he wouldn't be the guy commanding on the ground at the front. So he would be a little bit behind the lines, and they got in someone else, a half English chap actually, whose name was Robert Nivelle. And it was he who not only went on to win the Battle of Verdun, but it was he who said, "They shall not pass. Ils ne passeront pas." Which is widely attributed to Pétain, despite the fact that he never said it. But it's a quote from Verdun, and he was the hero of Verdun, and so people put these two things together in their minds. And so it was Nivelle who actually won, but then he went a bit too far. He then launched a load of more attacks, one particularly big one which involved something like 480 British tanks. He had no idea how to use them. They almost all got bogged down. It was a complete disaster, suffered horrendous casualties, and he was given the sack. And Pétain was made overall commander of the French army. The timing was bad, unfortunately, for Pétain. Possibly I should say a little bit more about Pétain. So I said he was a Catholic. He wasn't very tall, but he had a very military bearing. And he had a dashing blonde moustache, blonde hair, piercing grey-blue eyes, and he was something of a ladies' man. He never married, but he had an awful lot of mistresses. And we don't know how many illegitimate children. There was only one that he admitted to, and that was by a teenage shop girl who was young enough to be his daughter and almost his granddaughter. But he raised that child. Anyway, he had wanted this, yes, he wanted the vengeance. I've already mentioned that. So he was quite contemptuous of the British Army. Why is the British Army so small? I've mentioned before that the British Army was really quite small, and the French Army saw itself as being not just much bigger, but doing the brunt of the fighting. And when the war came to an end, it's significant who did the most fighting, because whoever did the most fighting is likely to think less of the ally, and it'll affect relations later on. And both the British under Haig and the French under Pétain had a pretty good argument for why they had actually won World War I and not someone else. They had done the brunt of the fighting. The French could say, look, we had a much bigger army. 2/3 of the front was manned by us, and oh my goodness, did we suffer a lot of casualties. The French suffered staggering casualties during World War I. If you were in the French army, there was a 27% chance that you would die. They lost 27% of their men dead. And there was something like a 2/3 chance that you would be a casualty. Yes, you were more likely to be dead or wounded, to be a casualty, than not if you were in the French army. The British only lost 10% of those men. Now, 10% by general war standards is still horrendous, but it's an awful lot less than 27%. So the French did have a very good argument to say, no, this is our war. We won this, not you. There were more of us, and more of us died. The British, on the other hand, could say, well, no, actually, we did the actual winning bit, though. The big push at the end, which changed things, the biggest defeat for the Germans in all time was the Battle of Amiens, and that was the British defeating the Germans. And then the British went forward, and by 1918, the British Army was really good. They'd mastered combined arms, how to use tanks, the creeping barrages, and finally they got the cavalry, and they really knew what they were doing by 1918. Yes, they'd made horrendous mistakes before, but hard lessons had been learned. Lessons which hadn't yet been learned by the Americans who'd just arrived. So in the last 12 weeks of the war, the British captured almost as many prisoners as all of the other allies put together. So the actual winning bit had been done, and at great cost, by the way. The British lost something like 250,000 men in the last stages of the war. They were taking casualties at the rate that hadn't been seen since 1914. So the British could say, OK, yes, overall in the war, more of the French have fought and more of them have died. But the actual winning bit, we did that, and we paid for it heavily. Wilfred Owen was killed crossing a canal right at the end of the war. I said that Pétain was given command of the army at an unfortunate time, but then I went off on a tangent, so I better come back to that. He was given command at a very unfortunate time because did you know that the French army went on strike? It's an extraordinary thing, but they did. The French army at the front during the war went on strike. And fortunately, the Germans didn't find out. If the Germans had found out, they could have launched a massive offensive and possibly have broken through and won, who knows. But the Germans didn't find out. The French army went on strike and didn't tell the British. That's right. The British on their flanks were unaware that the French army was on strike. The conditions were so bad, so many French people had died or been wounded, and they were being asked to make attack after futile attack, and they were sick of it, and they went on strike. And this was partly due to extreme left-wing agitators. Communism was an idea that had taken quite a foothold amongst the French army. But some brawlers in Paris got into a punch-up and the secret was out. The word got out, this rumour, that the French army had gone on strike, and this reached British intelligence. And now step forward Major General Sir Edward Spears. Sir Edward Spears was a remarkable soldier. He was a friend of Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill called him a paladin, one of the truest knights. And he'd been seriously wounded 4 times, and his chest was just a mass of ribbons. He'd won every medal, including several of the really big ones. He was bilingual, fluent in French, and he was a bit of a spy master as well. And he was promoted to be the chief liaison officer between the British and French cabinets. And he also wrote the code book. By the way, there was a joint code book that he wrote at the start of the war so that the French and British armies could be using the same codes so they could communicate more smoothly with each other. Anyway, he investigated and he went to the French lines and talked to people, and he was pretty shocked by what he found. He found people with communist red badges on, teaching each other to sing the Internationale, and other people who were being taken prisoners and corralled up in barns and so forth in the country. He even found French artillery units who were shelling other French units. Oh yeah, the rot had really set in, and Pétain had to stop the rot, and he did. He did some quite harsh things, like he rounded up 554 of the ringleaders, communist agitators and so forth, and sentenced them all to death. Not all of them actually died, but he did the sentencing them all to death. I think 49 of them were actually shot. And when there was an outbreak of self-inflicted wounds, for instance, men were literally shooting themselves in the foot to avoid having to go into battle. And when that was becoming an epidemic, he said, right, if anyone is found guilty of shooting himself in the foot, so for instance, if you have a suspicious bullet wound in the foot or anything like that, we will tie you to a stake at night in no man's land. And that definitely discouraged the others. But it wasn't just stick. He also had carrot. He also said, "Okay, right, you can have 7 days leave every 4 months." And he copied the British in a lot of ways, the way that they rotated units in and out of the front line, and setting up cheap canteens for them to buy food in railway stations and various other things. He improved conditions, and he also assured his men that he would not be ordering them forward in any big advances. He said it won't be necessary. We can just grind the Germans down as they attack us. Which was possibly a little bit strange thing to say, because you can't actually win a war that way. But he knew something that a lot of people didn't know, which was that the Americans were probably going to be arriving quite soon. So if I just hang here for a bit, the Americans will arrive, and that could turn the tide of the war. So Pétain was able to sort that out, and fast forwarding to the end of the World War I, the Allies won. But there was that argument as to who exactly had done the most fighting, because when you're fighting alongside an ally, if he messes up and lets you down and some of your men get killed, you don't forget that. That really rankles. But if he doesn't mess up and everything's fine, you don't have to worry about what he's getting on, doing over there. You just think about your attack, and if it's a successful attack, well then great. You don't particularly notice what the Allies did when things don't go wrong. But all those times that you were let down, they get remembered. Now, at the end of the war, negotiations started. They went on for 6 nasty months, and there were a lot of disagreements between the British and the French. A lot of the French, like Foch, for instance, he wanted the new border of Germany to be at the Rhine. So the Rhine will be the moat between the expanded France and Germany. The Germans will lose loads of territory, but that's not what the French got. What happened was that the borders went back to 1870, the pre-Franco-Prussian War. Alsace-Lorraine, which had changed hands, just changed back again. Some of these places, Schleswig-Holstein, had changed hands so many times in Europe, the cartographers were just getting sick of it. But this did not please the French. They'd made this massive sacrifice, had lost all these men, and we just get back what was previously ours anyway. That's it. And that contents you, the British. You're not going to back us up and say that, no, we should get more territory. And it didn't help that the British had signed a treaty. This happened a bit later, actually. The British signed a naval treaty with the Germans that on a day which just happened to be the 120th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. I think that was probably a coincidence, but it was a coincidence that the French definitely picked up on. The French had a lot of dead to bury. A lot of dead, and they wanted to do it well. They built big monuments to them. The French were burying their dead from the Great War, the war to end war, until 1938. That's how long it took. There was a visit by the British king, to. Sometimes I'll be saying England, by the way, in English in this. It's because of the French attitude, because the French refer to les Anglais, the English speakers. The British, they're all, yeah, all right, there's the Irish and the Welsh and the Scots, but they all speak English, so les Anglais, yeah, they get lumped together. Even the Americans and Australians, sometimes Canadians, they get lumped into Anglais a lot of the time. But if they want to throw it wider, they'll sometimes refer to them as Anglo-Saxons. But anyway. So the French always saw it as a war with England. Spanish Civil War, let's go to that. So 1936, the Spanish Civil War starts. It goes on till 1939. And a lot of people in France thought that they should be involved because there are a lot of particularly strong left-wing tendencies in France. There was someone who became prime minister. There was Léon Blum. He became prime minister, and he was a very strange guy, actually. He reminds me a lot of Disraeli. Disraeli, the late Victorian British prime minister, was Jewish and a velvet-wearing dandy, and he wrote novels. And Blum was Jewish and a velvet-wearing dandy, and he was a literary and drama critic. So there's quite a bit of similarity there. And they both had the gift of the gab, both became prime minister. Although Disraeli was in the Conservative Party and Blum was very, very definitely lefty, far left. In fact, it got really bad. A lot of the fascists between the war in France, they were out to get him. And they never actually killed him, but they did kill some of his associates. There were a lot of fascists in France. Now, some people might say, well, hang on, we had fascists and communists in Britain as well. Yes, but tiny numbers, and they never had the backing. In France, the fascists had big companies like the L'Oréal, the cosmetics company, backing them, and they recruited not just a handful of discontented thugs, but large numbers of people, including people from the professional classes. That makes a big difference. Yeah, so they were really after Blum. Now, Blum wanted to support the socialists in the Spanish Civil War against the Carlists. But there was a problem because there was a genuine risk of starting a French civil war. A genuine risk. So he daren't send French troops to the Spanish Civil War, but he wanted to. Now, between the wars, between World Wars I and II, we need to know just how stable was France. Was it a political basket case of a nation, or was it quite stable and well run? Well, I think one of the ways to look at this is how stable a nation will be represented, presumably by how stable its regimes are, how long they last, and so how many rulers have you got? So in democracy, for instance, so how many prime ministers? Well, Asquith was prime minister at the start of World War I, but he was at the end of quite a long. I think he lasted over 8 years, Asquith, in Britain, and then he handed over to Lloyd George in the middle of World War I, and he also had quite a long term. I think he lasted six and a half years, something like that. The French, during World War II, got through 7 prime ministers, which indicates some degree of turmoil. But in the 32 years between World War I and World War II, the French managed to get through 35 prime ministers. Now, there was a prime minister in Britain called Liz Truss. You may have heard of her. And in Britain, we find it endlessly hilarious that her term in office lasted days, not years, actual days. Now, in my lifetime, this has happened once, Liz Truss. But in France, that was standard. Yeah, the typical French prime minister was in office for a matter of days. 35 prime ministers in 32 years. So under a year was the average. And the longest one was, Pierre, what's his face? Poincaré. He lasted just over 3 years. But it was rare for a prime minister to last more than a year. Interestingly, it's a tradition they've kept up. Since the war, in Britain, we've had 19 prime ministers, and the French have had 54, whilst the Americans have had 15 presidents. So, yes, it seems that regimes change pretty quickly in France, and some of these changes were lurching right, left. Blum was definitely way over to the left. There was a chap called Paul Reynaud, and he was sort of the equivalent of Winston Churchill in France, in that he was an anti-appeaser. He was also a friend of Churchill's. They got on reasonably well. And he had a very like Churchill, he had a very up and down career. Unlike Churchill, he lived very openly with a mistress. Very strange, this is a bit of a culture clash, but yeah, he was married, but he lived quite openly with a mistress, because in France at the time, the stigma of divorce was quite great, but the stigma of living with your mistress, that's not a stigma at all. But there you go, that's a different culture. Anyway, he was an anti-appeaser, and he was in the cabinet under Daladier, who was another French prime minister. And then later, he was brought in to stiffen resolve, because he thought as an anti-appeaser, he would stiffen the resolve of the French government and the French people against the Germans, because World War II seemed to be coming along, and he was the anti-appeaser. So just as Churchill swept to power, replacing Chamberlain, the appeaser, so they had Reynaud. And the same thing happened, except there was a really big difference, that Reynaud was convinced that the French were going to lose, and that therefore it wasn't worth fighting. There were others. There was Pierre Laval. Now, Pierre Laval, who was twice prime minister, he was able at one point to get the French, British and Italians to sign a pact, a military pact against the Germans. Yes. And this held together until the Italians invaded Abyssinia, at which point the British said, well, we can't be allies to these people. They've just invaded Abyssinia. They're using flamethrowers against natives. What's going on? So the alliance fell apart, and Laval blamed the British and never forgave them. And that's more than a detail. You may think just how one person was a bit angry with the British is just a historical detail. But for reasons that will, I hope, become clear later in this video, no, that was actually quite significant. Now then, who else should I be telling you about? There was a guy called Darlin, another lefty, and he was a Freemason and an anti-clericalist. Oh yeah, this is another long-standing political battle within France. You know how humans are, they bunch together all sorts of ideas. If you think this, then you must also think this and this and this and this. And there you go, this is the package of ideas. And this is the side you're on now. And the people who don't accept this entire package of ideas, they're the enemy. And there were the Freemasons who were also anti-clericalist. And there was a government that swept to power which got rid of, well, it overturned the
Dear, oh dear, oh dear, it's all right for you. You only have to watch or listen to this stuff. I have to sit here for hour after hour editing it and witnessing myself struggle as I am here to remember the things that I've been swatting for days. Anyway, what I'm struggling to remember here is the Napoleonic Concordat of 1801. It was an agreement which reconciled the Catholic Church with the French Revolution.
It separated church and state, essentially, and said, right, no, church and state will be separate, which means that all those convent schools are now illegal. And the army was brought in, consternation, and those schools were forcibly closed down. And at times throughout the French history, it got to the stage where anti-clericalists and Catholics and Freemasons were dueling, sometimes to the death. Certainly around the time of the Dreyfus affair, this was happening, because sorry to go back here, but with the Dreyfus affair, he was Jewish and the Catholic Church had taken against him, and this all backfired horribly because the Freemason movement really took off in the army, because if you're a Freemason, you were accepting that package of ideas. That meant you were probably an anti-clericalist and probably not a Catholic, or at least not supporting the actions of the Catholic Church. So then that became really popular, and loads and loads and loads of French officers became Freemasons. One difference between the British and French armies was that in the British Army, it never paid to get into politics. In fact, it would really damage your career if you were political, whereas to get anywhere in the French Army, you had to be a politician. Pétain, towards the beginning of quite close to the beginning of the Second World War, said to the Italian ambassador, you know, the real enemy are the British. And that's very significant because Pétain was going to end up running the show in France at the start of World War II. And if he thought the British were the real enemy, I think you will agree that that was a bit of a problem, certainly a diplomatic one. Now, there was Edouard Daladier. He also became Prime Minister, and he was the equivalent of Neville Chamberlain. And he did a Chamberlain and declared peace in our time, but he didn't get the plaudits. On the same trip to Berlin, coming back from it, Neville Chamberlain got all the news coverage. He was on the balcony of Buckingham Palace waving to the crowd, waving his piece of white paper, peace in our time. And in France, the souvenir shops were filled with Neville Chamberlain-style umbrellas, would you believe? Oh yes, and that rankled a little bit. And I realised that I started talking about Francois Darlin. I don't think I finished. Never mind. So he was a Freemason. Oh, that's right, because I said Freemason and then went off on a tangent. Right. He had fought in World War I. He was a Navy man, but in World War I he didn't really get to do any sailing because at that time, after the Battle of Jutland, the Royal Navy was able to keep the sea completely safe, just on its own. So it was pointless, the French just doubling up. So the French Navy spent most of its time on land, and he was in command of an artillery unit using converted naval guns on land. And he was also a Freemason, and he was a bit of a surprise posting to the head of the Navy, but there he was. And he went to a conference in London, This was meant to be part of the cooperation of the Royal Navy, but there he was at the conference in London. He looked up he saw on that side, oh yeah, there's a picture of Trafalgar. Battle of Trafalgar. Yeah, I recognise that. And oh yeah, that's Waterloo. And this really didn't seem to impress him. Now, again, culture clash. You see, if I were in that situation and I saw some picture of a British defeat, I just think, oh, I know that. And I just find it funny or interesting. But he found it a slight to his honour. And he didn't, when it came to the crunch, want to work with the Royal Navy. Now, we're approaching World War II. It was only, do you know, in April in 1939 that the French and the British and the Polish signed that famous pact guaranteeing, the safety of Poland in practicality. I mean, they said, of course, officially, if any of you get attacked, but it was always going to be Poland. So it wasn't until quite late in the day that pact was signed. And when the balloon went up, there was something called the phony war. Yes, front lines were laid out on the borders of France and the like, but most of the time there were troops just sitting in trenches waiting for the action to start. And the French were very unimpressed by the number of troops that the British had sent. Just 10 divisions. The French had fielded 60. Why not more? Why not more? At the end of 1918, the British had a huge army, but once the war was over, they went home and the army dwindled and dwindled and dwindled, and expenditure on the army dwindled and dwindled. We're never going to have to fight another war in Europe. That war has been fought now. But as far as the French were concerned, no. At the end of World War I, you British let them march in good order, keeping their arms home. And now Germany looks still much like Germany. It's, yeah, okay, we've got Alsace-Lorraine, but, they're tiny territories. They were able to walk back, and they didn't pay enough. And you didn't do your bit, and you're not doing your bit now. Why is this British Expeditionary Force so flipping small? Well, the next bit of fighting didn't happen on land, that is. There was a lot of action at sea, Battle of River Plate and so forth. But on land, nothing much was happening in France. But in Norway, it all kicked off. And it amazed the Allies, because in just 36 hours, the Germans captured 7 Norwegian ports. They were using paratroopers for the first time. Oh, that was a new thing. And wow, they're really effective, aren't they? And the British didn't think that the Germans would send a significant naval force up, because, I mean, we're the British, right? We've got the Royal Navy. They'll know. They'll pay really dearly for that. It's so dangerous for the German Navy to set up the coast of Norway. We could trap them on the way down. And the Germans in the invasion of Norway lost a lot of ships, a lot of big ships. In fact, I'm going to list them at the bottom of the screen now. And in addition, these other ships were damaged so badly they were out of action for a lot of the rest of the war, even though they weren't actually sunk. So at sea, yes, it was a very costly invasion for the Germans, but on land they did embarrassingly well. Now the British did send forces out to Norway. Mildly amusing fact that whilst the British were in the act of mining, the British mined a lot of the entrances to harbours to Norway, and this was putting mines in Norwegian territorial waters. That was against international law, and the Norwegians were busy complaining about that whilst their ports were being taken by the Germans. Just unfortunate timing. Anyway, the British troops performed very poorly in Norway, and there were horrible mess-ups. So, for instance, at one point the British thought, right, we are going to load up all these troops on board, and we're going to sail out with troops, and there'll be a land invasion as well. Oh, no, wait a minute, change of plan. No, now it's just a naval operation. So they offloaded all the troops. Then they went over to Norway and went, oh, no, actually, no, we do. We didn't realise the situation was like this at all. We do need the troops, and they had to go back to get the troops. And during the delay, of course, the Germans are taking more territory and digging in and fortifying. But even so, it was possible for the British to outnumber the Germans in certain locales. But the British troops just were not trained for it. They didn't have any winter camo. The Germans were dressed in white, the British were dressed in khaki and could be seen against the snow very easily. They had no skis, but even if they had skis, they didn't know how to ski. The British didn't have ski troops, the Germans did, and even though they were outnumbered, they were running rings around the British, and it was a bit of a fiasco. And interestingly, Churchill came out of it strangely well, because Churchill, if you remember in World War I, it had been largely his idea to have the Gallipoli campaign, which had gone horribly, it could have gone well, but it didn't. It went horribly badly, and Churchill ended up effectively spending a year as a sort of penance, commanding a battalion of troops in the trenches in France to make up for that. But here he was also in favour of this fiasco of an attack on Norway, but it actually politically just worked out well for him, because a lot of people went, oh yeah, fair enough, yes, okay, it went wrong, but yeah, that was a good idea. One of the plans was to take Narvik and use it as a warm water port to get loads of supplies in to help the Finns against the Russians. The trouble is that, and by the way, the British did get as far as loading troops onto ships. They were ready to go to help the Finns. But then the Finns capitulated against the Russians and swapped sides and joined the Germans. They had to really to defend themselves against the Russians. The British couldn't really be seen to be sending troops to help what was now effectively an Axis power. So that plan was off. Sorry, bit of a side note. Anyway, the point of all this is that the French saw Norway as a British defeat. There were French troops involved, actually, and they didn't do much better. But most of the troops were British, and the idea was largely a British one. And the French saw it as another debacle. Anyway, there was another show in town which took everyone's eyes off Norway, because the Germans pushed through France and Dunkirk was happening, and an awful lot of troops had to be evacuated suddenly from the beaches, and it was all hands to that particular set of pumps. Now, whoa! Why am I suddenly so dramatically lit? Is this cyberspace? It's a green screen. Does my hair look fairly... It does, yeah. Green screen. Ah! It's because of the advert! Right. ExpressVPN, which stands for Virtual Private Network. You probably knew that. So instead of interacting just through your normal internet service provider directly, you can instead route your inquiries through servers provided by ExpressVPN, which are in 94 different countries, dotted all around the globe.
Update. It is now 105. Thank you.
And by this means, you can perhaps keep yourself a little bit more anonymous and secure, and you can pretend to be in one of those countries, which is quite handy. And maybe you're going to be flying to one of those countries next week, and you'd rather pay the prices that they sell airline tickets at in that country than in yours. And you may be shocked by how big the differences are. Well, that's one use you can put it to. Or maybe you want to watch, what's your favourite? Lord of the Rings, yeah, dum 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 dum. Yeah, you get your comfy chair, you sit down, you can and where's Lord of the Rings? Hang on, look, it was on there last week. They've taken it off, perhaps because they're always cycling things through. Well, where is Lord of the Rings available? The system will show you, and you can pretend to be in that country, and then you're watching Lord of the Rings. Or if you're outside Britain, you can pretend to be British, and then you can watch the treasure trove of stuff available on BBC iPlayer. So there you go. And if you're in a cafe, perhaps, and you can see someone at the next table who looks a bit dodgy to you, frankly, he's not just there for the scones, he's waiting there to, steal your identity or something. Well, if you route, rather than just through the cafe's own unsecured public Wi-Fi, you route your inquiries through your VPN, you get a certain amount of ease of mind, which is worth paying for. Now, some people will say you can remain completely anonymous with a VPN. No, you can't. Now, it may be a bit more difficult to find out who you are if you're using a VPN, in which case your average hacker's just going to not bother with you and just go for someone easier. That makes perfect sense. But if you have, say, done a bit of a murder, then one, well, you shouldn't have, because murders are wrong, and two, don't think you're going to stay anonymous and get away with it because of some anonymity online, because I think the police are very likely to, put in the extra bit of work to find out who you are. So yeah, you're more anonymous. I know there aren't degrees of anonymity exactly, but if there were degrees of anonymity, you'd be more anonymous, but not completely anonymous, which is, so there you go. But also just don't do murders because they're wrong. And it's pretty easy to use, and if I can use it, then I imagine pretty much anyone can. And it works on all sorts of devices as well, not just my proper computer, but you young folk use your other devices, don't you? Your mobile clever phones and stuff with screens on. Well, it works on those too. And if you want to find out about a 4-month free offer, oh yeah, 4 months. Other adverts on other channels have offered 3 months, but on this channel now, you're getting 4 months in your face, those other adverts. You can, for instance, click on the link in the description, or you could scan in the QR code. That's the funny mosaic thing, which is appearing somewhere on your screen now. Or if you're old school and you like to get those typing fingers out, you could go put in www.ExpressVPN, all one word, .com/Lindybeige. So, there you go. I think that's all the information you need. Oh, sorry. That was weird. Now, I've taken you through the lead up to World War II and the many and varied, well, not very varied, I suppose, tensions between the British and the French up until that point, all of which contributed to what came next. Now, it had been hoped that Paul Reynaud would be the stiffen resistance of the French government and would show a willingness to fight on, but no, he was a defeatist. And he said that he thought that Britain would fight to the very last Frenchman. Well, that was his attitude, so that wasn't helping. Now, Churchill, who had now come to power because Chamberlain was out because, well, obviously he was the appeaser. Churchill, in all seriousness, proposed to Pétain, why don't our two countries become one, just temporarily, for the duration of this war? Let France and Britain become a single nation. Let's combine our armies, our navies, the whole thing, and fight together. What do you say? And Pétain replied, "It is not in the French interest to marry a corpse." So that was his attitude. He also was convinced that the Germans were going to win. And to be fair to him, that was the majority of the worldwide opinion. Just about everyone looking on thought, well, World War II's over. It's happened already. Germany has captured Czechoslovakia and Austria and Poland and France and Belgium and Holland and Denmark and Norway. It's over. It's happened already. It's completely futile to carry on. The Americans were convinced that the British would be surrendering within the next 4 days, and if they carried on, they would perhaps last 2 weeks. Gibraltar was expected to last 2 days. It was absolutely futile, and loads of people within Britain were of this opinion, but Churchill was not one of them. And fortunately for world history, he was able to carry just enough opinion for Britain to carry on. The French were making things very difficult. Don't forget, at this point, fighting is still continuing. The Italians, very late to the party, invaded southeast France. Mussolini said that I just need to get to the conference table, I just need 2,000 Italian dead. He actually declared war on France the day that the French government left Paris. So, timing. And there were British bombers in southeastern France ready to bomb those invading Italian forces. But the French blocked the runway with their lorries. Why? Because they said, and they may have been right, that they feared the reprisals. Yes, if you bomb the fascist Italians, then when they come through and inevitably win, because it's all hopeless, they will take it out, and they'll take it out on us. You'll have flown away. You'll be all right. We have to think of ourselves. Now, Churchill had a problem. He had to look around, he had to think, well, okay, so all the people I was relying on in France have thrown in the towel. But if France is to continue at all, we need someone. Now, as a political expedient gesture, he had insisted that the British forces, British Navy, evacuate equal numbers of British and French from Dunkirk. That wasn't from the very start. It was during the evacuations that he gave that order. And so from that point onwards, for every British soldier taken across to Britain, they took one Frenchman, and they got 100,000 French out. So these could form the core of a free French army, but we'd need someone to lead them. But who? Well, an 8-year-old called Charles de Gaulle had, when the Fashoda incident happened, been listening to his father, who was a veteran of the Franco-Prussian War, say that this was a terrible slight on the French army, and that the honour had to be satisfied. And so, in due course, de Gaulle joined the army and became known to his colleagues as the Great Asparagus. He was a strange fellow with a very big nose, sticky out ears. He was 6'5" and weirdly gangling and uncoordinated. He was absolutely terrible at fencing and shooting and riding, things that Pétain excelled at. His instructors gave him pretty low marks across the board, but they did admire certain things about him, including an extraordinary stubbornness, and he would just never give in. And so, well, he had that. That's a quality, right? And he had decided that no, he would fight on. He had fought in World War I. For a while, actually, he'd been under the command of Pétain, by just a weird coincidence. He'd been captured, wounded, and had made multiple attempts. He'd fought at Verdun as well. He'd made multiple attempts to escape, all of them failure. But he didn't give up. That was the thing. He failed, and failed again. And he'd made so many attempts, in fact, that he was taken to the World War I equivalent of Colditz, the prison camp that the Germans put the people who just will keep insisting on escaping, or trying to escape, in de Gaulle's case. Anyway, so the British found some officer. Well, actually, I think it was our knight, Sir what's-his-face Spears. Hang on, I'll find this. Sir Edward Spears, that's the fella. Churchill's favourite spy master, who's still a favourite spy master in World War II. And he found de Gaulle and spirited him out of the country by air, took him to Jersey, where he landed, and comically he noted that the Frenchman asked, apparently in all innocence, whether what he was drinking was tea or coffee. Anyway, he was taken to Britain, and he was what Churchill had to work with. Okay, we'll go with this guy. And an interesting thing about de Gaulle is that, so far as I can tell, nobody got on with him. Nobody found him easy to work with. He was just stubbornness incarnate and infuriating. The British didn't get on with him, but then nobody did. The Italians didn't get on with him. The Americans didn't get on with him. The Dutch, all the various forces on the Allied side, nobody got, including, by the way, other French people, did not get on with de Gaulle. But anyway, he could form the core of a free French army. The trouble is that of those 100,000 men who had been, at tremendous effort, evacuated at the cost of leaving a lot of British back in France to become prisoners, almost all of them returned to France. They would rather just go back into captivity into France than carry on the fight. Of 100,000, only 3,000 stayed on to become the tiny, just token core of a free French army. But there was a political expedient in this. If some French, just any number of French, carried on the fight, then France could be said to be on the Allied side, so that at the end of a war, France would be in some sort of a negotiating position. But Pétain headed up a government, Vichy government. Now, Vichy was a town in the centre of France. It was a spa town, and it was off-season, so it had lots of hotel space available, and it was a convenient place to set up the government. The Germans governed the whole of the Atlantic seaboard, that's the western side of France, and the north, but a lot of the centre and south of France was governed by the Vichy government. France still had a government, it was still a nation state, only it was now on the Axis side. Darlan, if you remember, was head of the Navy, and he had a problem because as France was falling, the Navy skedaddled and got out of there. A lot of ships, about half the fleet, went to North Africa, various ports, and a lot of them went to England. Now, they'd been doing this quite habitually, actually, because during the Spanish Civil War, British code breakers had intercepted a lot of Italian broadcasts, which made it plain that the Italians were sinking British and French merchant ships that were trying to trade with Spain. And of course, you can't give away that you've broken the code. So what they did is they organised a conference in Switzerland and came to something called the Neon Agreement, which was an agreement between the French and British navies that they could essentially use each other's facilities. They could come and go into each other's ports, and they did for years. And it wasn't just that they didn't need permission to go to a port. They didn't even need to announce that they were going to. They could just turn up unannounced, and they could expect and receive resupply. And this proved very handy. And it was in that atmosphere that these ships went to all these various ports in North Africa and in Britain. About 200 vessels had gone to Britain. And one of these was the world's biggest submarine, the Surcouf, which was a very unusual, here's a picture of it, a very unusual machine. It had two 8-inch guns on it, that's major gun armament for a submarine, and it also had a watertight aircraft hangar on it. And the idea was that you took the aircraft out of the hangar, assembled it, sent it off, it spotted the enemy, then came back, you got it back to the ship, back onto the ship, or boat, although actually I think the French did call them ships, and then you disassemble it, put it back into the aircraft hangar and seal the hangar, and then, imagining that the enemy is still where it had just been spotted, you make your way there, then you pop up quite close to it, point guns at it and say, "Ha-ha! Give in, or we'll blow you up with our big guns." 8-inch guns. You may call them 203 millimeters, but they were 8-inch. You think the world's metric, but you were wrong. Even the French used inch caliber guns. So you would then possibly finish the thing off once you'd gone aboard and plundered it with torpedoes. So it did have torpedoes as well, but it was meant to fight using its gun. Anyway, it never really worked. When it fled to Britain, it was at first doing just 4 knots. It had never fired a shot in anger. There was nothing to do with enemy action. It was just subject to constant breakdowns and all manner of mechanical problems. And later they managed to get it up to 10 knots, but still whoop-de-doo. So it limped to Devonport in Plymouth on the South English coast. So that was one of the very many vessels that made it there. Now Daland, he wanted his fleet back, not least because he was commander of the French fleet, but also he needed a bargaining position. You see, during the capture of France, during the Blitzkrieg, there were an awful lot of French prisoners of war taken by the Germans, and if he wanted to negotiate to get his men back, it's not going to look very good, is it? If his ships are all in enemy harbours and not cooperating, if he could get them back and say, OK, you can use them, or scuttle them even to prevent the enemy, that's the British, from using them, then that would make him look good, and maybe he'd be in a good bargaining position to get those prisoners back. The ships in the French Navy, some of them were first rate. Well, close to first rate. They were very new. Some of them were so new, in fact, they were actually unfinished. There was one ship that went to North Africa and it just had a big hole in its deck where one of the turrets was meant to be, but it hadn't been installed yet. They were very fast by the standards of the day. A lot of them had very good armour. But one thing that they definitely lacked, they had no radar or ASDIC, which is a bit odd, particularly because ASDIC, the A in ASDIC, the acronym, stands for Allied, and the French had actually been part of the early development plan, but they dropped out after a while, and the British carried on, and, well, the British had ASDIC and radar, but the French didn't. But anyway, these were pretty big, pretty powerful ships. It was a formidable navy, definitely of great use to Hitler. Now, Hitler wanted the fleet scuttled. Well, ideally, of course, he wanted the fleet so that he could use it, but he'd rather have it scuttled than the British get it. So panicking the French into ordering them to scuttle their fleet was quite a good move from Hitler's point of view. So what would you do then? It's a difficult situation. Who's in the right here? There's no obvious right and wrong. Now, I've been talking about the beginning of the last war with France, and one could argue that the last war with France started on Wednesday, on the 3rd of July in 1940 in Devonport. I mentioned the Surcouf. Other significant... Actually, one thing, before I go further, I have to say something on the subject of names. If I were an author writing all this as a work of fiction, and I thought, right, I want some really good names for the ships, but I think a little bit of symbolism in there might be good. Well, would I, for instance, as with the flotilla of minesweepers at Dartmouth, come up with a flotilla, the flagship of which was the Entente cordiale? Oops. Now, the elderly battleship moored on the quayside at Devonport was called Paris. An elderly, right. So the Paris, which has just fallen, that old city, and sheltering next to it under this cliff-like eminence of the massive battleship next to it, is the Surcouf, the massive submarine I mentioned, named after Robert Surcouf, who was a famous French 18th century pirate who was particularly known for plundering British merchant vessels. Yeah. Now, the Royal Navy was pretty keen to make sure that these French ships, which had big, powerful guns on them, didn't get any ideas. And nearby was a big battleship with 14-inch guns. I don't think that they were pointing straight at it, but they only have to turn the turrets. It only takes a few seconds. They had them pretty well covered, and that battleship was called the Revenge. I think my editor would probably say, do you know what, Lloyd? I think, I like that you got a bit of symbolism in these ship names, but I think they're a bit too on the nose. You couldn't make it up, could you? Anyway, so, Capitaine de Corvette, Paul Martin, was somewhat concerned. He was the captain of the Surcouf, and he thought the British were up for something. Just a couple of days before, Admiral Sir Martin Dunbar Naismith, VC, the rather amiable commander of Western Approaches, and ever such a senior guy, also an ex-submariner, had just dropped by to have a look at the submarine, because as an ex-submariner himself, why not? And he had with him a French-speaking liaison officer, Lieutenant Griffiths, and it did seem all very amiable, like a social visit, but the captain thought, these English are up to something. That wasn't just a social call. I think they were spying. It was a scouting mission. I must be careful. So he took certain measures. He closed all but one of the hatches on the top. There were 4 hatches along the top, but he ordered that only one be left open, and he had 2 armed sentries up top at all times. They were armed with the big pistols, and he'd already taken certain measures towards scuttling, drawn up a list of things to be destroyed in the event of scuttling, and had even started defusing his own torpedoes and so forth, making preparations for scuttling the boat. Now, to get to the submarine, you could get onto the Paris and then go through the Paris and then across a gangplank which led onto the deck of the Surcouf. But he thought, I think if the British come, they're going to come from the open water. They're going to come from the water side by boats, possibly at night. Yeah, I better brief my sentries and tell them to be extra vigilant for that. It turned out that he was right. Now, on that fateful morning, somewhere around 4:30, just as the first rays of dawn were poking impotent marmalade fingers over the horizon, scattering the shadows like convent girls menaced by a tramp, a message came through, an officers-only message came through from Bordeaux. Bordeaux was the new HQ of the French Navy. It had been moved there because, well, the Germans. And an officer on board called Cresson received this, but realised, oh, this is in the big code. I better get the big bumper code book out. So he left his office and ran to the safe somewhere else on the submarine. Got the when they really mean it code book out, and came back and started decoding. And there was quite a bit to this decoding because this was ever so encrypted. This was clearly a very important message. The captain, I think, was still asleep. It's 4:30 in the morning. Why shouldn't he be? But he thought this could be big. Meanwhile, a load of boats were approaching in the darkness, just as Martin had predicted, and they knew they had to be stealthy. Only the people at the tiller guiding them could be seen. Everyone else was down, heads down, below the gunwales, so they couldn't be seen. They came up to the ship, but the sentries saw them, and one of them started raising alarm, banging on the conning tower, and ran forward, got to the one hatch which was open on the bow, and disappeared down it, and it was closed behind him. Now, an officer called Talbot was commanding and the initial rush, and he was first onto the ship, and he managed to capture one of the sentries, but then realised, oh, now what do I do? We were expecting 4 open hatches, and we've got none. How do you get into a closed submarine? It's bulletproof and they're ever so watertight. But he had a notion, so he climbed up a ladder onto the conning tower and got his torch out and had a look around and examined the hatch and noticed something pretty quickly. Well, one, disappointingly, it was closed, but also the clips on it were quite similar to the clips on a British submarine, which were designed so that they could be opened by a rescue diver in an emergency from the outside. Meanwhile, Crescent downstairs had finally decoded the message. It was very clear. They were to scuttle the ship now, scuttle it thoroughly, without hesitation. The British were going to try to capture the ships, so scuttling was the thing to do. And he realised, oh my goodness, I must raise the alarm. So he got out and he ran down the corridors of the gangways, I suppose they're called, of the submarine, shouting, the English are coming, or l'anglais arrive, or something like that. And he gave orders for the scuttling to start, and he sounded the alarm. People were to wake up, and you had to go and get the captain. Right. So he ran back to the command post to get the captain, and realised that he was already too late. The English were already there. They'd opened that hatch and come down into the command post, which is immediately below. It's where the the periscope is. And there were 60 British who quickly spread out around the ship and opened up the other hatches and started waking up sleeping Frenchmen. There were 60 of them. Half of them were Marines. Most of those were armed with rifles. The NCOs generally had pistols. Most of the rest were sailors, and they were just armed with pickaxe handles and the like. And a lot of the fitters had mallets. But these, okay, you could bonk a Frenchman with a mallet, I suppose. But the principal purpose was that they were expecting certain levers perhaps to have been jammed in the on position so that if the engine was started up, it would go to destruction. And so these mallets were for whacking the levers out of their jammed positions. So it was an anti-scuttling device, if you like. So a lot of armed men were aboard, and they were in a tight space, quite literally. They're aboard a submarine. It was a summer's day. It was stiflingly hot and pretty smelly down there. And some of the smells that I've heard described included alien smells, for the British, that is, like French tobacco and coffee. So Griffiths was there as well, Lieutenant Griffith, the same liaison officer who had accompanied the Admiral just a few days before. He was back to do the same job. He was a French speaker, but what he really wanted to do was to get back to his ship in the Mediterranean and get back into the war. He was really keen to get back into the war, and that, as many men were at the time. But there was this job to be done first. So, Commander Lofty Sprague enters the story now. So he steps aboard and he takes over. He's the senior commander of this takeover. Meanwhile, his admiral, the Dunbar Naismith, was going aboard the Paris just next door. And Dunbar Naismith had a letter prepared and had given out various orders. He was the main planner of the operation to take over all these ships, and he'd told his men that good humour and friendliness are of more value than arms. But he'd also given his men, not all of them terribly well educated, you understand, just 4 simple phrases for the capture of the Surcouf, which they would probably find handy. Nous sommes la marine britannique. Nous sommes vos camarades. Montes. Monty. Go up. And then the 4th one takes something of a lurch towards the dark. Levez vos mains. Put your hands up. Anyway, the letter that was being read out on the Paris, next door, the big battleship, by the Admiral, started rather generously. The French nation has fought gallantly to a standstill. And he then carried on making the basic points over about 5 paragraphs that Hitler wasn't to be trusted because, well, he really wasn't to be trusted. He had broken so many promises up to this point. It was ridiculous, and the French really shouldn't be believing a word he said. And 2, they must understand that the British can't afford the French fleet to fall into the hands of the Germans. And yes, it was a very powerful fleet. It wasn't as powerful as the Royal Navy. It only had 1 aircraft carrier to the Royal Navy's 7, but it was still, I tell you, it was the 4th biggest fleet in the world. And he ended, any resistance can only cause unnecessary bloodshed, which will be of advantage to our common enemy. Fair point. And Dunbar Naismith noted that Admiral Kayol, who was aboard the Paris, was naturally very distressed. He told me that he had considered the question of scuttling his ships, but decided not to do it as it would have obstructed the harbour and inconvenienced me. Now, there were 200 ships moored around Britain from France, and in about 100, I say roughly, there were most of those were quite small, but there were battleships, cruisers, and big ones. And in roughly 199 of those, the French heard the words and thought, this is a bit buff. What could they do? So fair enough, they went quietly. The Surcouf was the exception. The French officers just refused to leave. It took quite a lot of work, Talbot running up and down with his men, trying to get these surly, sleepy Frenchmen to understand what was going on and to get them to leave the craft. But meanwhile, there was a corps of officers that just wasn't going anywhere. And after a while, Sprague took them to the wardroom, which was directly below the command post, and addressed them. The French officers were one side of the wardroom table, and he and his fellows were the other side. And he tried again to explain to them, look, you can see what the situation is here. We are taking over. Please, I just need you to leave, and you will be treated fairly, all that stuff. But they were absolutely, no, we're not leaving. We're not leaving until we are ordered by our admiral to leave. Now, Sprague had a letter which he purported to be from the admiral, urging them to join the Free French Navy. But when they heard this letter, they didn't believe a word of it. It was made up. It strikes me that that was a bad move by the British. That was a bad move by whoever wrote that letter. Possibly it was Sprague's own initiative to have created that falsehood. But that sort of a lie is likely to backfire on you, I would have thought. So I see that as a mistake. Anyway, the French saw through it and said, we don't believe that. We need to hear it from his own lips. But how was that going to happen? Because if you say, OK, off you go then, no, you won't let us back in, will you? But eventually, the captain left to go to the admiral, and he turned to Commandant de Corvette, what was his name? Pichevin, that was it, who was then to take over. He was his second in command. So now Pichevin has taken over whilst the captain goes to consult the admiral. Did you really say that? Well, time passed and the atmosphere didn't improve very much. What was Sprague to do? Well, things were moved on a little bit when someone pleading his bladder, or need to go to the head, the loo, he set off from this group, and one of the British observing him thought, that guy looks suspicious. I'll send a man with a mallet after him to just make sure that he is just going to the head. He wasn't. The man was an electrician, and he went to the main light switches, the power supply, and turned the lights all off. There was a very quick scuffle, boom, ow, and the lights all came back on again, and it seemed that quick scuffle was very briskly won by the Englishman. But in that brief blackout, a couple of things had happened. One French officer, a mechanic, Daniel, had nipped into his cabin nearby and started ripping up the manuals for the engines and the like, with the idea of flushing them down ahead and getting rid of them. And this was one of the things that he was supposed to do. This was one of the agreed, it was part of the scuttling procedure, if you like. You don't want anything secret falling into the hands of the enemy, the English. Another thing that happened was that the doctor, who shared the cabin with him, stood in front of the door and was guarding this and obscuring what was going on. And another thing that was going on was that the French were arming themselves. Now, the British didn't know that the French officers had pistols. They knew how things were done on a British ship, in which the officers generally just defended themselves with good manners. And they had imagined that things were done similarly on a French ship, and so did not expect the French to have pistols, which they did. Now, in fact, the British boarding the Paris had found pistols as well in the cabins of the officers there, but the officers hadn't availed themselves of those pistols. They'd clearly got them out and got them ready, but then had chosen, what's the point? What's the point? If I'm holding a pistol, I'm just more likely to get shot by a Marine. So, no, they just left them in their cabins. But on the Surcouf, they got their pistols. But the British, at this point, probably didn't know. I say probably. I can give you a lot of details about what's going on here, because for reasons that will become clear, this was a much studied incident, and there were a lot of people who inquired very thoroughly, asking everyone who was there, what did you see? What did you know? And so this was all a matter of record. Anyway, it seems that the British didn't know that the French officers had pistols, and they had availed themselves, or at least some of them had, during the darkness. And now things got extremely nasty. There was a coldness of sort in the air of mood. Some of the French later described Sprague as looking very sweaty and very pale. I suppose all Englishmen might have looked pale to them, and it was stifling in there, but even so, they thought that he was particularly sweaty and particularly pale. "I have my orders," he said, in French. And then he drew his pistol. It was one of these, a Webley, .455, a lot of stopping power. "If you don't leave, I'll kill you." Well, Crescent looked at him and said, "Fire if you want. I'm not moving." What would you have done at this point? You have your orders. If you're Sprague, you've got to get these guys out, and you have been given license. Use force if necessary, but ideally don't use force. Why are these men not leaving? Can they not see that their situation is hopeless? Well, at this point, he decided, I'll call for reinforcements. So he called down 10 guys from the command post that was just above. And they came down the companionway, the sort of ladder-like thing that went up to the command post. And among these was leading seaman, which is roughly the equivalent of a sergeant in the Navy, Albert Webb. And Albert, he was carrying one of these. Oh yeah, the good old, whoops, sorry, can't do it with a piece of paper in my hand. There you go. A short magazine Lee Enfield. Only his looked considerably more intimidating because his had a 17-inch sword bayonet on the end of it. So it turned it into a great big spear. And he was apparently a very big, intimidating looking man, this sergeant, this leading seaman. And so there he was, looking right. So, and another gaggle of them around him. So now the French officers, the four of them, have got a lot of weapons, not necessarily pointed at them, but being shown. Now, the idea of these weapons wasn't to start a fight, it was to prevent a fight from starting. If you show that you stand no chance, look, you're surrounded, we've got loads of weapons, it's over, then you won't have to fight. So much for the theory. Now, there were 3 officers standing in front and one behind I've not mentioned yet. And his name was Bouillon, Louis Bouillon. And what can I say about him? He was in his late 20s, he was recently married, he smoked a pipe. He was also the gunnery officer in charge of the 8-inch guns. And he had armed himself with a .32 MAB pistol. This isn't one, but it was something a bit like this, an automatic. So, he was standing behind and perhaps was a little obscured. The lighting was rather dim. And, well, he decided that Sprague couldn't tolerate having his bluff called any more than, in his own words, we could allow ourselves to be thrown off our ship and threatened with death without reacting. And this is what he later said. I took a pace forward and shot at Commander Sprague, Lieutenant Griffiths, and the 2 sailors. And then again on their officers. As I was shooting, I moved to the companionway, that's the ladder, and that was at the moment I was wounded. And I fired at a sailor who, no doubt, kneeling in the command post and showing only his steel helmet at the top of the companionway, was shooting at me. He was actually lying on his belly, it was later reported. But anyway, the man doing the shooting there was Chief Petty Officer Mott. The significance of that exchange of fire is that it was the first exchange of fire between 2 official representatives of the French and British governments acting in an official capacity, shooting at each other. It was the first, if you like, war between Britain and France since Waterloo for 125 years. And Mott hit Bouillon with one of his rounds, and it went in here and sort of came out just above the right nipple, but it didn't kill him, and he was able to reload his pistol. Sprague and Griffiths were considerably less fortunate. Sprague had been hit in the neck, in the belly, and in the collarbone, and it was the collarbone that was worst because it burst an artery which was spraying blood all over the place. Griffiths had been hit in the in the hip and hip, arm, and in the liver. Interestingly, neither man fell down. Sprague was able to prop himself up against a wall, and Griffiths hooked an arm through the ladder to up to the command post, and so neither had actually fallen. But they were both in an extremely bad way. Sprague had apparently squeezed off a single round, but it had gone to no effect, perhaps just into the floor or something. It was a total surprise. This gunfire came out of nowhere. The 3 men at the front, who were presumably commanding the attention, were just standing there, and then suddenly, bang, 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 without warning, started. But even during that gunfire, there was a second lot of bangs, and then a scream, and then a clatter. What had happened was that Webb, if you remember who was holding this, had, during the firing, charged not at the man who was doing the firing, but into the cabin just next to them. Now, it's possible that he thought that that's where the firing was coming from. It was dimly lit, and the confusion that just just the sheer noise the gun makes is quite discombobulating, and one that's being fired towards you at close range is extremely disconcerting, and in a confined space is considerably louder. And if that confined space is a submarine, I hate to think how loud that gun was. So you've got flashes and smoke and panic and gun. Where's it coming from? He could see the three officers at the front, and none of them seemed to be firing, so maybe it was coming from there. I think I saw a guy go in there. So he hastened in with his rifle and bayonet. In that room, there was Daniel, who was still ripping up manuals and to stuff into the head, and Dr. Ministère. Now, he was the ship's doctor who shared a cabin with the mechanic, and he had gone in there to arm himself with a pistol. Now, he had a .25 ladies' handbag pistol. The thing that Bouillon had been firing was the sort of pistol that French officers armed themselves with when they were going to the dodgier dominions around the world. As if they went on shore, they liked to have something reasonably slim and easy to carry with them. Well, in the doctor's case, he had a lady's handbag pistol, a .25. Now, we don't know what Webb's intention was going in, but he rushed in carrying one of these. He looked pretty intimidating, and the doctor immediately opened fire. And Webb then charged at him. Bang, 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 bang. He emptied the entire magazine. In fact, I have his account here. Dr. Ministère. The English sergeant, leading Seaman Webb, rushes, I don't know why he uses the present tense, but there you go, he's French, rushes towards us with his fixed bayonet. I fire the whole of my magazine at him. Carried forward by his rush, he falls dead at our feet in the wash basin. Unfortunately, he had time to fire, and engineer mechanicien Daniel, hit in the right shoulder, cries out and collapses. I step over the body of the dead sergeant and go for the English sailor, that was able seaman Heath, who had followed Webb in, who followed him and seemed to be having trouble with his revolver. I managed to disarm him with one blow of my fist, send him reeling against the curtain which covers the door to engineer mechanicien Catherine's cabin. I move forward, and with a second, better blow, which dislocates my thumb, I send him rolling at the floor of the companionway to the wardroom, where he lies still. Now, that does make him sound a little bit heroic and manly and decisive and very, very calm. I wonder quite how calm he could have been, though. A sergeant was charging him with a bayonet, and he was firing. And do you really just calmly empty all the rounds in one go from your little pistol into someone? And this may explain why he's actually wrong in two important ways. For one thing, he says that the sergeant just dropped dead in the wash basin at his feet. It later turned out that no, he'd been able to bayonet Danielle to death before dying, which tells you something, doesn't it, about the stopping power of a .25. And you notice that he finds it very easy to overpower this weirdly struggling Heath. What he doesn't mention here is that Heath had been shot 7 times. You see, of the 8 rounds that he fired from his little pistol into Webb, 7 of them had gone all the way through and into Heath behind. He'd been hit multiple times in the head and shoulders and once in the arm. So I think it's fair to say that Heath probably wasn't at his fighting peak at that point for that reason. Although it's a bit of a miracle that he wasn't dead, but they were quite small caliber bullets, and presumably a lot of their energy had been taken out of them as they went through Webb. Anyway, so now what do? So everyone who was in sight of the bullets has now got very quickly out of harm's way, and the Frenchmen, these officers, now find there are now 5 of them, 4 from the Ron room and the doctor joining them. They've now captured a wardroom on an otherwise pretty empty submarine, which has been prepared for scuttling, and has 60 armed men within it, and there are plenty of armed men outside, even if by some miracle they could fight their way off the ship, then what do? Or if they stay on the ship, they can't crew the whole ship, not themselves. They can't take it anywhere or do anything with it. Their situation is completely futile. So they argue. I believe you were very wrong to do that, said Cresson to Bouillon. And at this point, they then start an argument. Bouillon saying, but along the lines of, what do you mean? I've just saved your life. He said he would kill you. Yeah, would kill me if I didn't leave the ship. Come on, he was threatening you. Yes, he was threatening me, but I think he was bluffing. Anyway, the doctor took Bouillon's side and said that no, what Bouillon did was the right thing to do. Martin, if you remember, had left the ship to go to the Paris to ask whether this letter was genuine or not. And there he found that... Oh, no, wait a minute, sorry. Got it the wrong way around. There was a lull. Do beg your pardon. There was a lull at this point, and negotiations started again. And Pichevin decided, look, it's over. He disarmed Bouillon, prizing the gun from his fingers, putting it on the table, and said, fini. But then talking to the British, shouting up the hatch at the top of the companionway, there was a problem because they were still refusing to leave. But possibly he could leave with some good face if he was given orders by his captain to leave. But how could he get those orders? Because the captain had gone on to the Paris to consult the admiral. So Cresson got a British officer to say on his, this was Talbot, I believe, to give him his word as an officer that he would let him return. And on that condition, he was let go. He went on to the Paris, found his captain, who was resigned. Oh well, okay. They've surrendered the Paris. The rest of the fleet is surrendering. So, yeah, I suppose we have to really. Wasn't happy about it, but he was resigned to the situation. And so you might think, okay, things can resolve there. But there were, of course, dying and wounded people. The two officers, Sprague and Griffiths, were very severely wounded, but they were not dead. And people went over to them, gave them a bit of first aid, but they weren't doctors. They didn't really know what to do. Now, the British had planned, actually it was done by Naismith who had planned it. He had planned the operation pretty well. And he had loads of ambulances there. But the purpose of the ambulances was for taking French ill and wounded off their ships and taking them to British hospitals. He didn't have any doctors standing by. There were no medics that went on board with the raiding parties. And so there was no doctor amongst the British to attend to these two dying officers. But wait, there was a doctor on board the Surcouf. So, oh, well, that's okay. So they asked him to tend to the dying. And he refused. He instead spent a long time looking at Bouillon's wound. And Talbot was absolutely furious. After first aid was given, it must have been 25 minutes before the doctor reached Commander Sprague, and a further 10 to a quarter of an hour before Lieutenant Griffiths was attended to. The men were definitely alive. Sprague was even talking. At some point, Heath staggers into the wardroom, bleeding from his 7 wounds, and for the first time revealed to everyone, wait a minute, that's the doctor, that's the guy who shot Webb. No one had known this until Heath pointed it out at this point, but no one believed Heath because he was staggering around covered in blood and people just thought he was raving. It took him quite a while to convince everyone, no, that doctor there, I'll show you the pistol. He eventually convinced them, yep, the doctor had shot Webb. Webb was dead, but there were 2 officers there who could be saved. But over and over again, the doctor just told them to wait and carried on attending to Bouillard. Eventually, another French doctor from the Paris was brought on, and later 3 Royal Navy doctors did turn up. And the British were taken out, and Bouillard, would you believe, Sprague and Bouillard actually went to hospital in the same ambulance. Bouillard made a full recovery, but the 2 officers he shot didn't. Sprague died the next day and Griffiths the day after that. Would they have lived had the doctor attended to them immediately? There is no way of knowing. They were alive, they survived for, in Griffiths' case, 2 days in hospital, so had a fair bit of life in him. They could have stopped the bleeding. Medical technology was not as advanced then as it is now, but they may well have been savable. There's just no way of knowing. A priest was then sent from the Paris on board, a Catholic French priest who gave to the 2 dead men, Daniel, the bayoneted Daniel, and Webb with the 8.25 wounds in him, he gave them something curious to me: conditional absolution. You are absolved of your sin as long as... It's a strange thing, alien to me, but that's what he gave. There was an account by a French doctor as well, going aboard and finding everyone really jittery. And everywhere he went, he was searched again and again, and with very jittery people pointing pistols at him. And every time he tried to make a move to walk round the body to go and get some bit of equipment. Where are you going? What are you doing? And he had guns pointing at him all the time. It was not ideal conditions. But Royal Navy, as I say, Royal Navy doctors eventually came in and took over. As the priest was leaving, one of the British sailors next to the gangplank just whispered as he went past, "How sad. How sad." Yeah, it was very sad. Those 4 men were the first 4 to die in the last war with France. And some of you may be saying, wait a minute. Wait a minute. You promised us the last war with France. This wasn't a war. This was just a shootout in a submarine. 4 deaths. Okay, 4 tragic deaths. It's terrible. But it's only 4. That's not a war. World War II was pretty big. France was being governed from Vichy, and this was how the war started. You have to have a cause of war, a casus belli, and here you go. Vichy now had one. The British had taken by force a French ship, and blood had been shed. World War II against France is not a topic that is talked about much, and perhaps it should be talked about a bit more, because people think, wait a minute, the French were on the Allied side, right? Most of them weren't. Vichy France was on the Axis side, and there were very large, significant battles yet to be fought. Madagascar is a very big place off the east coast of Africa, and if you have bases there, you can threaten shipping in the Indian Ocean and on the way to the Suez Canal. You can't tolerate enemy bases operating from there, and it had to be taken off the French, and battles were fought between the British and the French in Madagascar. The Allies had to take Morocco off the French. That fighting was done mostly by the Americans. There was fighting in the Middle East, in North Africa, and there are loads of little islands dotted about, including in the Pacific. The French under Vichy were participants in World War II. I imagine I'll be making more videos about them in the future. And if you want to see the graves of the first men to die in the last war against France, you'll find them in Western Mill Cemetery in Plymouth. So you see, gentle viewer, I hope that the first hour of this video was not a waste of time, was quite relevant to the point I've been making. The last war with France started on the Surcouf. The second half of this video was a description of the taking of the Surcouf and the gunfight that started the last war with France. But the first half of this video was explaining why perhaps the Vichy government was just so opposed to Britain. Why were they so ready to collaborate? Well, it could well be because 4 men headed up the Vichy government. One was called Flandin. I haven't actually mentioned him yet. But Darlin, the naval captain, do you remember the guy who saw Trafalgar and Waterloo during that conference and had his ships taken from him? He was one. And Laval, the man who put together that alliance between Italy, France and Britain, which collapsed, and he blamed Britain, and he lost his job as a prime minister as a result, and his fall from power rankled him and he blamed Britain for it. And Pétain, the man who said that the true enemy was actually Britain. So that was the last war with France. Lindybeige!